Hello, everyone. My name is Maria Lind. I am currently serving as the Counselor of Culture at the Embassy of Sweden in Moscow. The course that is starting tonight is called Why Curate Art, and it consists of 5 sessions, with each session relating to one particular project or one period of time that I have worked in different art institutions. So the series is using my curatorial practice as a background in order to discuss why it is meaningful, interesting, and perhaps even important to curate art. Tonight, I will be speaking about the 3-year program that happened at Kunstverein München, the art association in Munich between 2002 and 2004. And I'm super happy that Katie Chukhrov is acting as a respondent, which means that you, Katie, will come in after my presentation, which will be about 50 minutes to an hour. And you will have questions and comments, and we will hopefully have a discussion. And after that, it will be possible for those of you who have questions and or comments to jump in. And this is the structure of the whole series. So a presentation and then a respondent, a different respondent every time. Why curate art? First of all, the most important thing about curating is art. And now I would like to start to share my screen. The most important thing about curating is art and the possibility to be close to art and artists. And here we go, share. So take, for example, the video installation from 2004 by Annika Eriksson, shown on 4 TV monitors, which was a common medium or a common form of presentation at the time, where this artist spent a couple of weeks in and around a newly built office complex in the outskirts of Munich. The commissioner was the reinsurance company Allianz, so an insurance company that is insuring other insurance companies, a company that is deeply involved with risk management and macro perspectives in terms of risk and how insurances play into that. Annika Eriksson filmed the building itself, the interior, the exterior, noted the abundance of glass. I cannot help but think about the work of Dan Graham, the great artist who just passed away. In a way, Annika Eriksson picked up on his studies of architecture from the 70s and 80s. And here we are a few decades later with buildings looking very much the same and with a pronounced rhetoric from the side of the company of transparency, of a desire to be visible, clear, accessible, even if, of course, only the employees could enter the building and guests only with special permission. Annika Eriksson also talked to the staff. A number of members of staff agreed to be interviewed by her in places that they themselves chose in this huge building. And one of them, as you can see here, speculated about the notion of safety. And here we can remember that this was not long after the sociologist Ulrich Beck started to publish on the notion of the security society obsessed with safety and security. It also included the technicians, the handymen, taking care of the operations of the building itself. So this artwork by Annika Eriksson, which was commissioned by Kunstverein München, us, the team there, was something that related to a recent development in the city with this big office complex. At the same time, it was also delving into issues more broader than that in terms of how society then was at the beginning of what we know much better today, which is precisely a certain kind of risk management that is taking more and more space in many discussions. So curating, from my perspective, is very much about making art happen, drawing from art, creating contexts where art can thrive, and situations where people can meet art. And this is relevant, interesting, and even important, because I do find contemporary art the most successful, you could say, form of understanding, meaning it is a form of understanding that helps us relate to the reality we are in. It is unusually rich compared to other forms of understanding, because in fact it's like a sponge, so it sucks up them and many other things. It is parallel to science, philosophy, politics, psychology, etc. But it also encompasses all of these in itself, and then reworks things and has as an output something else that has reworked all of these things. And I personally do not know any other form of understanding that does it in such a multifaceted and inspiring way as contemporary art. So Kunstverein München in Munich, in the south of Germany, I was appointed the director there in 2002, and I spent 3 years in the city working at this reputable institution. It was founded in 1829 in a different building than the one you see here, because this is the one where it is located today, at the far end of the street with a long yellow facade. It was from the beginning a members association, and that is particular to Kunstvereine, or art associations, which are still common in the German-speaking part of Europe. It used to be common in Scandinavia as well, but less so nowadays. And they were part of the emerging bourgeois public sphere, where people got together in order to discuss things that they were interested in. Often at the beginning in the 19th century, the Kunstvereine, the art associations, also rented spaces. They organized exhibitions. They tended to be exhibitions where the art was for sale. And like many other, or all other parts of cultural life in Germany during the 30s and up until the end of the Second World War, were completely dominated by the Nazi cultural policy. And after the Second World War, when they were trying to get back to some of their earlier roots, they became sites of experimentation, artistic experimentation, curatorial experimentation. And this is what you can say about a number of Kunstvereine in different German cities today. Almost all cities do have one such art association, but not all of them are professional, with a team that is hired with the competence of working with contemporary art. But those who do, maybe 10, 15 of them, they are really significant in the art ecology of the German-speaking art world. This is where many artists have their first important exhibitions, or where they have mid-career surveys, etc. So in other words, they are players to count on within the art scene. So this particular one is one of the oldest, and from the other side of the building, it looks like this. It's a building from the late 18th century, purpose-built to be a picture gallery for the royal collection of the Bavarian monarchy. The trees are part of a park, which is called the Hofgarten, the court garden. And the building that you can spot on the right-hand side is actually the former royal palace. So this is the heart of Munich, comparatively conservative and wealthy city with a problematic past, as it is, of course, the city where the Nazi movement was born. And the Kunstverein spaces, and they're still there today, have shop windows like the ones on the left. And if by chance someone recognizes the arches, it could be because you have looked at the paintings of Giorgio de Chirico. These are the arches that inspired him because he was a student at the Art Academy in Munich in the early 20th century. I was fortunate enough when I started in 2002 to be able to put together a team. I hired the curator Sören Grammel, and we worked with the assistant curator Katrina Brown, eventually also Judith Schwarzbart, and for some period of time, Julienne Lortz, and also Tessa Braun. So the curatorial team worked closely together, conceptualizing what these 3 years were going to look like, because that was part of our thinking, that 3 years, which was my contract, is a good length of time if you want to try something new, and you can still see some of the effects, and you can adjust things and change things, etc. The starting point for us was that because of the Kunstvereine having a history as places of experimentation, we should continue that. And it was essential for us to say that an art institution like a Kunstverein should not be a garage, a parking house for art. It should be more closely connected to art and artists. And we also thought that it was important to follow art and artists in their footsteps, to shadow them, to learn from them. And that included rhythms. So to move away from the 2 to 3 month group show rhythm with one show replacing another. Instead, we were interested in having several projects running at the same time at different speeds. One of those formats, as we called them, were the Sputnik Projects. We invited around a dozen artists, critics, and curators to be our Sputniks, our fellow travelers. And we asked them to give us input into what such an art institution could be, and also should be. And we were in constant dialogue with them individually and sometimes collectively. And in addition to that, each Sputnik was invited to propose a project. Apollonia Schuster, the artist and architect who today is based in Oslo, who is originally from Ljubljana, she was asked to rethink the lobby. When we came, it was white, very sterile, with a stone floor, echoey sound, and she transformed it into what you can see in this image. In other words, a cozier lobby with different colors, different types of surfaces. So she put in a rubber carpet. She also designed a bar like a piece of furniture, which was flexible so that you could move it around depending on what type of activity you wanted to have in the lobby, because it was not only for selling coffee, it was also for film screenings, discussions, etc. Instead of buying new furniture, Apollonia proposed that we upholstered the old chairs and that we repainted the old tables. We also introduced a library in the lobby, as well as files, artist files. So on the right-hand side on the shelf, you can see white boxes. Those were for the artists that we worked with, so that the visitors could study a bit more of their work. On the left, you can see a desk. That was the reception desk where the reception person was sitting. And on top of the desk, a pile of newsletters. We did not make catalogs. Instead, we made newsletters twice a year that were talking about upcoming projects, that were documenting projects we had done, but which also could contain specially commissioned essays. And one particular series, which I'm still fond of, is the one where we interviewed one member for each issue, because this membership structure is what is so particular about the Kunstverein. And in the first one, we interviewed what at the time was the oldest member of the Kunstverein, who then was in her mid-90s and who had become a member already, I believe, in the 60s. And this continued with older and younger people, but all of them talking about their relationship to art and why they were members, etc. So the different rhythms. We opened with a group exhibition, which we called Exchange and Transform, which was about precisely that, exchange between people, exchange and transformation of materials. And on the right-hand side, you can see a battery connected to a light. It's a work by Simon Starling, where he charged this battery with solar cells on a particular hill in Berlin, where one of the airplane pioneers used to make his very early flying experiments at the beginning of the 20th century. Or this copy of The Lobby from downstairs, a work by Bick van der Pol. They simply made a replica of Apollonia Schuster's lobby design, but placed it on the second floor instead. And here, a local artist group called Schleusenet, which means something like a smuggling network, or a schleuse is also a lock, the kind of lock that you would have in a river or between lakes where the water level is different, in which ships go so that they can move from one level to the other. And this group started already in the late 90s to work in relation to migration. So they occupied the installation by Bick van der Pol for most of the exhibition period, doing the work that they were usually doing, which was looking at questions of migration. For example, how at the time migration was reported in the media. And because they were very knowledgeable, they could often detect mistakes, and they would then write back to the newspapers, which was the most common medium at the time, or they would contact politicians, etc. They would also organize meetings here with other people, with other activist groups related to migration issues. And the copy of the lobby, the work by Bik van der Pol, traveled later to Budapest, to the Studio Gallery, which is an artist-run space in Budapest. So the idea of exchange continued with some of the artworks far beyond the actual group exhibition, and sometimes also without that being pre-planned, but occurring as the show went along, because it was a long exhibition. It was up for almost half a year in an attempt to make it possible for works to land, to sink in. And one work which was directly about exchange was the No Ghost, Just a Shell project initiated by the artists Pierre Huyghe and Philippe Perrenot in 1999, when they bought a manga character in Japan, the cheapest possible manga character, which is something that is sold and bought for the production of mangas, because the companies don't have the time to create new characters all the time. So some companies specialize in this, and they each gave this cheap manga, who only had a face and a name, Anne Lee, with content through video works. Each of them made a video work with her, about her, and then they invited their artist friends to do the same. So the work itself became a bit like a relay race, where new people could add their chapter to the story about Anne Lee. So we showed the episodes that existed at the time. Afterwards, there were many more. Elin Wikström, a Gothenburg-based artist, she decided to not buy any clothes for a period of time, and instead she would make her clothes using second-hand clothes. So she set up her sewing studio in the exhibition space for most of the exhibition period. And her setup attracted visitors in the sense that they wanted to have a conversation. So as much as she was sewing, she was also talking to people about consumption, about recycling, etc., about the fashion industry and how it plays into these things. We had a work by Ursula Biemann, a video work about migration in Latin America. There was a work with many different components by Oliver Ressler. This is what democracy looks like, which was kind of a frightening account of growing violence from the side of police in relation to demonstrations. And Oliver Ressler showed a different perspective than the one that was and still is typically shown in mainstream media. And it also involved a poster campaign, and then back to the lobby again, a slightly different view. And on the left, I'm sitting at the reception desk, and that was not unusual. The curatorial team and also the administrator, we all took turns working at the reception desk, and it was a wonderful way of getting to know the visitors, of understanding who they were and what their questions and comments were. And also it was a really nice atmosphere. Apollonia Schuster's lobby transformation didn't end with what you saw on the pictures. She continued, and she wanted to open another entrance door to the street. If you remember the image at the beginning of the long street, The entrance door that was in use was the one that you can see on the right-hand side on Apollonia's plan, not visible at all from the street. So we applied for a permission to follow Apollonia's Sputnik project proposal, which was to open this entrance that you can see as number or as A. Unfortunately, we were not granted this permission, so it stayed on the level of being a suggestion. Another Sputnik was the artist Carrie Young, who wanted to continue her work with communication, with strategies of making something known. And she at the same time wanted to support the Kunstverein, this new team. Here you can see the curator Sören Grammel, the curator Katrina Brown, myself, and our administrator Renate, and a lady with a watch on her arm. She was a professional communication skills trainer, often hired by Siemens, the big company which has its headquarters in Munich. And it was Carrie's project that involved us having a communication skills course as a team with this professional lady in order to better communicate the Kunstverein to the outside world, to negotiate better with the board, perhaps also with the artists. So it was a one-day course where we did the different exercises, we pulled our hair a bit, we laughed a bit, and I think we actually came out feeling that we had learned a few new things, not least the importance of the elevator pitch. So this was a part of Carrie Young's Sputnik project that was not at all visible to the visitors to the Kunstverein. And this didn't matter to us or to her, because her Sputnik project continued throughout the 3 years with different iterations throughout the 3 years within the communication infrastructure. So, for example, she used merchandise and picked up on slogans that we know from the history of the labor movement, but which today have, or at the time, 2002 to 4, had taken on other meanings. And they were for free for the visitors, pens, rulers with quotes by famous Marxists, basically. And also a communication campaign that went out through our own shop window. This is what computers looked like back in the day, and also beyond. So, for example, there should have been an image here of a big ad in the Munich subway, but that one is gone. A membership card. That's typical of a Kunstverein as a membership organization. So she decided to use this membership card as another vehicle for her Sputnik project. She designed it as a loyalty card, you know, the kind you get at Costa or other cafes. So you get a stamp for every coffee you buy, and then in the end you get a free coffee, or sometimes it's books in bookshops, or it can be dry cleaning at the dry cleaners, etc. So one visit meant one stamp, red stamps, as you can see. And after 8 stamps, the member would get a gift. And this was explained in the yearly letter that each member the Kunstverein had around 1,000 members at the time, was being sent at the beginning of the year, also explaining that after 8 stamps there would be a gift. What was the gift? You might wonder. It was this book, Ulrich Kluge's book about the 1918-1919 Soviet Republic in Munich. This was a short-lived Soviet republic for about 3 months, which was not much discussed in Munich in the early 2000s. I would say there was even a reluctance to bring it up in conversations. So for Carrie Young, this was a way of activating a part of local history that had been kind of pushed aside, you could say. Well, Sputnik projects, but also long-term research projects. One of them was Studio Europe, initiated by the incredible artist and curator Marion van Osten, who very sadly passed away at the end of 2020. And Studio Europe was one of the first bigger projects looking at post-Fordist working conditions, looking at how work has transformed from the dominance of permanent positions to gigs, to short-term contracts, and how the ideals of the worker have changed along with this. For example, the worker from the 90s onwards being expected to be flexible, to be creative, to be inventive, to be sometimes even unconventional. Notions that we know from art history and which Marion van Osten and her many collaborators in this project played upon. So how the artist has become a bit of a role model for what we can call the new worker. It was a project that meant almost 1 year of research with professionals from different disciplines involved. It materialized as an exhibition with a massive installation in the middle of the main exhibition space, consisting of secondhand office furniture and small artworks inserted into this. You can see a couple of monitors and projections as well. And a wall painting by Michaela Melian, a Munich-based artist, depicting the Munich bohemia of the late 19th century, where this romantic idea of the artist that has given echoes in the contemporary model of the worker was depicted. We also sometimes did straightforward one-person presentations. This was a commission, Natasha Sader Hagigian, her first major institutional commission, where she looked at the idea of value and how the Bretton Woods Agreement was dissolved in 1973. So the dollar was then no longer connected to gold and the value of gold, which actually is the beginning of a lot of neoliberal financial and economic policy making. And she joined that in her video projection that you can see here with the oil crisis and her own childhood memory of empty highways. Because for some time in 1973, I remember it myself, it was not possible to go by car the way you were accustomed to. Another example of what we did with a different rhythm was a collective experiment with, I think we were 5 curators and 8 artists or something like that. It was called it was called Totally Motivated, a socio-cultural maneuver, where we together looked at the notion of amateur creativity and did it in radically different ways, including constructing this massive reed ceiling, a work by Michael Beutler, resting on the wooden pillars in the middle, only attached by rope as a boat technique with sails, etc. Under this extra ceiling, there were artworks. There was a situation designed by artist Luca Frey, based in Malmö, which functioned as a seating, as a shelf for printed material, and also for numerous discussions around amateur creativity, but also around collective agency. Just another angle. And a makeshift staircase, making it possible for the visitors to come to the second floor, because above the ceiling there was a second exhibition curated by Michael Beutler himself with a number of his peers from Frankfurt, from the Städelschule where he went, and an exhibition that could then only be seen from the platform where the staircase ended. So a bit like a parallel world above the ceiling. An incredible giant graphite drawing by Carla Zaccanini from Sao Paulo. She now lives in Malmö. So it was a paper frottage with graphite covering the whole floor of the exhibition space. Bernd Kraus, another one of our Sputniks, he occupied one of the small spaces in the Kunstverein and made it into a basement hobby workshop. So since the 90s, he has been exploring in his own artistic practice notions of creativity from the side of the amateur, the untrained one, and the professional one, in extremely playful and funny installations. He even included his father's hobby wooden sculptures. And this is his homemade solarium. Those of you who are in Russia can see his work in the exhibition Art and Life in Critical Zones in Izhevsk from the end of March. So here is Bernd's editorial office, because he has a newspaper that is handwritten, still going, where he reports from the place where he is exhibiting. Just a view from this totally motivated, a socio-cultural maneuver. The activist group Kanakatak, which worked with anti-racism already back then. And views that indicate that the exhibition also became a platform for different kinds of discussions. And this I have to mention, because the little red label, it was the work of Matthias Faldbacken, an Oslo-based artist, is a facsimile of signs that were hanging in the exact same space in 1937. They are from the Entartete Kunst exhibition, the Degenerate art exhibition, which actually took place in what is today Kunstverein München, which at the time was a plaster cast museum. And the plaster casts were evacuated so that the Nazi regime could display what they thought was degenerate art, i.e. modernist work that they detested. And the little signs said, paid for by the tax money of the German workers. And for Matthias Fallbacken, this was a scary parallel to arguments that he quite often heard in Norway, and other people have heard in other places still today, about what tax money should or should not be used for. There were also parties, poetry readings, and more research projects. In this case, the Kunstverein itself, its own history. I said before that it was founded in 1829. I made a mistake. It was 1823. And we wanted to highlight the history. When the team arrived, we found out that there was basically no archive in the sense that you could go and look for old catalogs or old documents or old photo documentation. There was material, but it was completely chaotic. We managed to get a grant from a cultural foundation in Germany, which allowed us to organize this material for about a year. And then we asked two artists, Liam Gillick and Mabe Betonico. Liam is based in New York and Mabe in Sao Paulo, to help us filter the material. So here on the three tables that you can see, designed by Liam Gillick, there is documentary material connected to three important exhibitions during the history of the Kunstverein in the 20th century that me and Søren Grammel, the curator, had picked out. And the shelf itself contained all the files, the document files with correspondence, contracts, etc., that we could find and that were labeled and put in order in different ways. But they were not available to the visitors to open. There was a bar in front of the shelf because of juridical reasons. Mabe Betonico was interested in what went into these files, and she devised envelopes with cut-out parts, so we could show some of them if we did not display the entire content of, let's say, a letter or a contract. And we also combined this with some photographs from the three exhibitions that had been picked out. And one of them was this, a bit of a riot connected to the academy in Munich. The students from there were invited to show at the Kunstverein in 1971, and that led to a scandal when they pointed out that some of the professors in 71 were the same people who taught there in the 30s and 40s, meaning they must have been accepting the Nazi regime, otherwise they would not have worked there. In the big exhibition space, we had been able to make the photographic archive organized. So the piece of furniture on the right contained boxes with the photos beautifully organized, and seating and tables for people to browse, and also the possibility to look for names in a database and find out what was available in relation to specific artists. And catalogs organized chronologically and alphabetically. And on the wall, a list of all the artist names that we could find, which became like a wallpaper that had shown or done something with the Kunstverein, as long as this material could show. And it was actually from the Second World War, because the archive from before vanished in the Munich bombings. Posters were put up. We changed the posters every week. Different team members could make a selection from old posters. And we had a series of broadcasts about the history of the Kunstverein, where people who had been engaged with the program were invited on the stage. It was, of course, not broadcast on real television all the time, but once we managed to get it sent on television, but the others were recorded and then made available on video, both VHS and DVD. And also in the exhibition space after the events. And we did a big symposium, Curating with Light Luggage, which talked about different curatorial methodologies which did not require a big infrastructure, i.e. they could work with light luggage. Clémentine Delis was one of the speakers. This also eventually became a book with the same title. So I will wrap up very soon, but I would like to share a couple of more projects with you. The Sputnik Deimantas Narkevičius, who lives and works in Vilnius, he, as his Sputnik project, wanted to make a group show with 3 artists and himself being one of them. And here is just an installation shot where you can see his commissioned work for this show, which is called Kaimietis, and it looks at the group of people who stayed partisans in the woods of Lithuania after the end of the Second World War, fighting against the Soviet power. And he juxtaposed that to certain old and new monuments in Vilnius. The 2 other artists were Peter Watkins, the incredible filmmaker, and also Mindaugas Šimkus, a young artist from Lithuania. So different rhythms, longer group shows, solo projects running for 2 to 3 months, research projects with a long lead up time, and then 3 to 4 months on display. One project which really stretched out was the retrospective that we did with Christine Borland, who's based in Glasgow. Her retrospective lasted for a whole year, and it took place in different parts of the building and also beyond the building. We were interested in doing her retrospective in this particular way because her work deals with time. There is a lot about life and death and about historical perspectives. So we displayed, for instance, this work as the first one, and you can glimpse on the right things that you might recognize from my slides from the Exchange and Transform group exhibition. So at the same time, when we started our program in 2002 as the group show, we also started Christine Borland's retrospective, but with only one work, the one that she did for the sculpture project in Münster in 1997. where she researched the anatomical institute at the university in Münster, which was infested with eugenics or race biology during the 30s and 40s. After a few months, that work was taken away, and we reactivated another of her works. And then the third one happened after that in our shop windows. A work that she originally made for a gallery in Prague. Another one took place in a porta cabin outside the academy in Munich. And this is a work that she did the first time in Newcastle. And it borrows the methodology of a criminal investigator who was commissioned by the artist to look at a particular site, a certain number of square meters, and treat this as if a crime had happened. So the criminal investigator that she hired collected material, took imprints of footprints, etc. So when we did this in Munich, she wanted any place in public space in Munich, knowing how complicated the history of the city is. And we ended up doing it next to the Art Academy. So the findings of this particular criminal investigator was then displayed in a porta cabin that was open to the public every day. Another retrospective that we did was with Recipient, whose background is in Thailand and who lives between New York and Chiang Mai. And it was actually one work that functioned as a trampoline or a platform to organize a one-week workshop with people who had been involved with Recipient work since the early 90s, fellow artists, students, curators, art historians, etc. And we gathered at the Kunstverein around this reconstructed one work from 1993, Angst essen Seele auf, a title you might recognize from Fassbinder. It's one of Fassbinder's films, and it's also the film that is shown on the monitor here. And what we did during this week was to talk about the thoughts and the references that had gone into Rickrett's work by that time. And it meant a lot of eating together, talking, and looking at his work, but not staying with the work. Looking at the work, particular pieces, but then allowing the participants to take a step themselves from this work. And people started to write, people started to paint, people started to have other conversations or to make site visits in Munich in order to actually, I would say, continue his work. So the retrospective became the continuation of his work, the things that he and his work had put in motion. Yet another format before we conclude. We worked with documentary video work, was very much Søren Grammel's baby project. Es ist schwer, das Reale zu berühren. It's hard to touch the real, which began in 2002 with monthly monographic screenings with artists whose work is related to documentary practices. So it was, for instance, Annika Eriksson with the Arbeitswelt, the world of work that I showed at the beginning, but also people like Ruth Kasere and Hito Steyer. And then we invited all those to propose other artists working in a similar vein to a big video festival in the summer for a weekend. And then it continued with monographic monthly screenings and another festival the following summer. And we also collected some of the works that had been shown with the artist's permission and made a video library. And this library was quite quickly, this is from the video festival. And then we had the video library in the Kunstverein for a period, and then it went on tour. And now, this was my last image. So it went on tour. And this is how another one of our Sputniks, the curator Katrina Brown, based in Glasgow, did her Sputnik project. She did not want to propose something to the Kunstverein, but instead she wanted to take this video archive to the place where she was working at the time in Scotland. So I think I will end here and welcome Katie and the rest of you.
Thank you, Maria. It was really very inspiring because from the book you get the strategic image, but then from your talk you get more concrete flesh, and it's really important. So am I to start, or we have some other interventions?
I think it's great if you want to start.
Thanks a lot, Maria. It was really a pleasure and an honor for me to be invited to be your respondent. And you started with claiming how important art is. So I will a little bit refer back to the strategic elements that construct the curatorial team, because I was really impressed to what extent this transformative power of new curatorial governmentality was constructed and generated by the team. What I find crucial in the curatorial strategy of the Munich Kunstverein, the strategies that place this institution in its transformative impact in the frame of other new institutionalist projects such as Roseum, Vanabe, Tensta, Konsthall, Ljubljana Modern Museum, are the following approaches, which are inscribed in the project but could be seen in a broader perspective. Well, first of all, the dismissal of the show logic in favor of project and process-based activities, which are grounded in research, and Maria talked about this importance of research. Second, inscription of the communicative part of art process into the artwork itself. So certain sort of care about how work and its conceptual meaning is communicated broadly to the public. So its production of this communicative element instead of being supplementary addition to the work post factum. So the artist, when she creates the artwork, already inscribes in it this institutional communicative part in collaboration with the institution to a certain extent. And this is really something new, and it can be productive, but it maybe could have some drawbacks, which I could emphasize later. Third, a construction of public as audience, a construction of public not as audience, but as collaborative community. I think this is from Charles Esch's statement. Then fourth, curating an institutional work seen as performative agency, and it comes from your collaborator, Katrina Schlieben. Yes, exactly. Sorry, there are so many names that I got confused, but her passage on performative agency of institution, not simply curator, but institution, was really important. And last but not least, incorporation of institutional critique into institution, when critique is not something that undermines institution and somehow negates it, but somehow collaborates and constructively co-works with it, cohabits with it. And this comes from your statements already in the journal on curating, when you discuss the power and the strategies of the new institutionalism. Now, this definitely had immense advantages, and when I was reading about it, I immediately had some kind of macro political landscape around it, because the whole tendency was, of course, transformative, but also we should remember that it coincided with the establishment of EU, establishment of Euro, and the necessity to integrate East European, Baltic republics and their art practices and historicize them. So this was one thing. Another thing was that there was the new opportunity for independent curators to take the innovative bureaucratic charge over refurbished as art institutions, which now had to be more democratic, more transparent and open, but as well more creative in their social impact and social work. And this is an incredible thing when a creative curator becomes the head of the institution. Something that never happened, for instance, in post-socialist countries in Russia. We always have this split. Somebody who is managing the institution is never chief curator or is never in charge of generating the ideas. So I find this very productive systemically. And as I said, this never happened in post-Soviet countries yet. Such institution becomes flexible because it researches, creates it in collaboration with artists who intervene, but they don't undermine. So the artist can be invited, but what was very impressive for me, that sometimes artist invites institution as well to somehow collaborate with him. So what was important in one of the texts from this Cahiers Office of Contemporary Art of Norway was that artists really want institution to collaborate with them. It's not that they are pressed or they are controlled, but to a certain extent, this was the demand of artistic collectives to collaborate with this new, more flexible and more transparent instituent practices. So definitely when I remember how Tensta konsthall functioned, or some smaller instituent practices like Konsthall C in Stockholm, or NBK or NGBK in Berlin, I definitely have in mind this sort of collaboration. And in that case, the institution becomes a tool of cognition and investigation nonetheless than the artist or a curator. And interestingly, just to emphasize another contextual component coinciding with this time, 2002, 2004, this was the discussion of instituent practices emerging precisely at this period with the publication of Antonio Negri and Michael Hart's Empire and Multitude. And of course, they meant something else by instituent practices than simply new institutionalism, because their vision of instituent practice was, to my mind, more political than social, and it had this micro-revolutionary impact. Yet certain quasi-institutions that emerged at that time, beginning of 2000, were very much reminiscent to what transformations were taking place in what you describe with Munich Kunstverein, what was taking place in Tensta, and the other enlisted institutions. And these instituent practices are IFLAX, of course, United Nations Plaza, and European Institute for Progressive Cultural Politics with its journal Transversal. You know about it because this frame was also very much connected with the EU new program of expanded field of cultural emancipation after the Cold War. And I think that this idea that the curator and the artistic collective can be in charge of social process was definitely acquiring new agency with the new construction of EU and new hopes what the future EU had to be, because interestingly the funding also was not anymore coming from board members like museums. They had this private funding from the members of the board, but this was a new funding, not national, not necessarily national state funding, but the EU funding, which you can see from all those projects.
Kitty, can I just
yes.
say something here?
Yes, sure.
It's interesting that you're bringing up funding, and follow the money is, of course, always a good thing to do. And the Kunstverein in Munich got some money from the municipality, but it had to be applied for, a little bit from the region, some from membership fees, but then the main source in order to make the projects, in addition to just paying the salaries and the rent, was actually German foundations. So private foundations in Germany supporting contemporary art, as well as the Bundeskulturstiftung, the Federal Foundation for Culture, and also one foundation connected to an insurance company. So we did not get any European funding.
Okay.
But I think EIPCP got it from early on, and afterwards I think it became even more important, because 2004, we remember, was the year when the Baltic states and some of the other southeastern European countries became members of the European Union.
Yeah, exactly. So this was very important period. Yes, definitely. You are right. I didn't know about that. I was just relying on what I read in this document of Contemporary Art of Norway with the references to EU fundings. And well, observing some other institutions, this funding was definitely ultimately quite important. So an important achievement in that case was that art institution is not anymore a marketing tool, and it is not responsible to be certain sort of piling of artworks, but it can become school, it can become the landscape of social work, public work, and define the social vectors. This probably instigated a huge hope for the whole cultural context and cultural left as a whole. And crucial in new institutional projects is this optimistic confidence that art can shape emancipatory and progressively cognitive landscapes of society. And of course, I remember this extreme optimism, but now I have to a little bit dwell on some pessimistic issues which followed and which are clear for all of us, because the first probably pessimist crack in this belief that cultural work and institutions like this can be socially productive and efficient was a financial crisis, then Occupy movement defeat, and finally one of the biggest cracks and biggest failures, or to my mind disappointments, was the 2016 election of Trump, to say nothing about contemporary situation with the pandemic, when the influence of cultural institutions is shrinking and shrinking with the bigger and bigger power of biopolitical and biomedical policies. So this institutional context generally that you delineated with Munich project, I find extremely inspiring and productive. But at the same time, I wanted a little bit to refer back to my romantic imaginaries about art, which split my own aspirations about art into this productive, socially engaged optimist, and on the other hand, some kind of nihilist, a little bit modernist, negativisms, which we have a little bit from Chantal Mouffe ideas. So I will mention very briefly this split or double bind. So indeed, audience turning into public space or a creative community was a reality, definitely. But my questions would be, community around the art institution was not necessarily a broad public, the public that is a mass public, right? Something that gives a right to curators like Ekaterina Dogut claim that art is not responsive to broader audiences like film or like music, etc. Now, the second moment, that collaborative frame for public is seen too positively, well, in these projects, as if it can be immediately constructive. So what I did not see in this collaboration, where is the rupture? So everything is too beautiful and functioning too well. Maybe at that period it was definitely functioning too well, and there was this harmony between institution, curator, and artist. Nevertheless, I mean, we see that certain ruptures definitely should have existed, because if we look at the genesis of contemporary art, sociality and public in it very often were seen negatively. So contemporary art has this genesis or this ancestrality, that it was often looking at sociality in a very insulting, provoking, and challenging way. And one of these examples for me, when formally you have socially engaged art, very productive socially, but de facto it's certain kind of spitting on the audience, is the Berlin Biennial 12, curated by Artur Żmijewski, when he used this social debate to simply commit an iconoclastic gesture. So instead of expanding the institution, inviting artists, he simply made it collapse. The whole event, the whole venue, and the artistic agency in it, creating some sort of empty space where public space was the space of negativity. And this is what Chantal Mouffe is emphasizing when she says that, well, public space or the commons, public commons like Agon, may not be necessarily some harmony, but they may be the place where the artist sometimes challenges or dumps the society, and then the negotiation starts. So we cannot rely on public space so smoothly to lubricate the artistic community into public space immediately. Of course, public space can be trained, can be educated, but sometimes it can also be very far away, and there can be rupture between the art institution and the public. For instance, I remember my impression from United Nations Plaza I was a newcomer from Russia. How difficult.
Do you want to mention maybe what that was, United Nations Plaza?
United Nations Plaza was an initiative, a school, art as school, which was founded by Anton Vidokle and Iflax, when his curatorship of Cyprus Biennial didn't take place, and then he moved the whole project into Berlin as United Nations Plaza, and it became the hub or the laboratory for 2 years for artists, curators, critics, writers from all over the world. But interestingly, the audience of United Nations Plaza was not the general audience of Germany, but it was the producers from all over the world who were producing, but at the same time constructing the audience of this project, being the community itself. To repeat that, this community was the art community, so it didn't have this broad reference to non-artistic community. And I'm finishing here. This brings me to my last argument about this negative genesis of contemporary art, which exists in art, but which is often somehow disguised in the projects of social engagement. And this negativity, it somehow got revealed after these several failures that I enumerated: Occupy defeat, Trump and conservative governments elections. What is really important for me in this is that very often what was suspicious for me in this harmony of socially engaged collaboration, that contemporary art is based on self-sublation. So on certain sort of negative gesture, when it sublates its own aesthetics and its own belief that it can be an affirmative practice. So it is, to a certain sense, devoid of crafts. It is empty, it is skillless, it is more skillless than design or other arts. But when this negativity is forgotten, when art forgets what it lost, so the modernist art, the avant-garde art still remembers its loss and this negative rupture. In what I see in social engagement, that there was this belief that now this rupture can be filled by a certain kind of collaboration, but the results showed that the real social efficiency was not reached, because, I mean, Trump election and many other social reactionary realia show that art was not as powerful in terms of its social agency as it believed it would be. Therefore, my question is, can we relate this harmony that we have in those beautiful institutions to the present situation, when more and more layers protecting art from this, from those horrors that we have to face today are at hand, and aren't we in a situation when maybe the social collaboration is not so easy anymore, when we do not know how sociality will behave and what painful areas can be touched upon. And very last thing, which remains a question for me about bureaucracy. I mean, what I find a huge achievement of these new institutional projects, including Munich, including your curatorship, including your work, Maria, is this new frame of bureaucratic work, when the bureaucrat is an artist, a poet, a curator at the same time. On the other hand, when the artist is invited to this new institutional, a little bit protected sphere, the artist stops to be really aggressive as Andrea Fraser was. Because, I mean, my belief is that the most radical art installs its own bureaucratic power and overshadows the institution as bureaucracy. So when Fraser intervenes into institution, she somehow surpasses it with her own bureaucratic agency, foreshadowing it. When Hake does it, he also does it. So in this new condition, the artists are milder. They don't have this bureaucratic aggressivity, which you have in some sort of radical art. For instance, in Warhol project, he's his own institution, he's his own bureaucratic law. So I would end here and how to deal with this.
Thank you, Katie. That's very rich and many things to pick up. I would maybe like to start just by elaborating a little bit on the notion of new institutionalism. So it was coined in 2003 or 2004 by Jonas Ekeberg, who is a critic and partly curator based in Oslo. He wrote an essay for a little publication that came out of the Office for Contemporary Art, Norway, which at the time was directed by Ute Mette Bauer, who is a big role model for me, an incredible curator and person. And he and they together with the volume pointed out a certain number of institutional initiatives at the time, which, as you so well described, Katie, were doing some of these things in terms of experimenting with bureaucracy, inviting artists in a different way, etc. So one of them was the Kunstverein München that Jonas Ekeberg was mentioning. Another one was Roseum in Malmö. It was an institution that existed for some years. Today, the building of Roseum is taken by the Moderna Museet, Malmö, the Modern Museum, which is Sweden's national museum for modern and contemporary art, with a mothership in Stockholm. And I think he also mentioned platform in Istanbul, which in the early 2000s was a residency program in Istanbul where the motor was Vasif Kortun.
Vasif Kortun, can you remind the title?
No, platform. It was not. It was called Platform at the time, and then that institution morphed into what today is SALT.
Yeah, SALT Galata.
Yeah, but that came much later. So in the early 2000s, it was called Platform. Mm-hmm. But these were just some examples. There were others that could have been brought in, but if I remember correctly, those were the ones that Jonas Ekeberg dwelled on. So that's one thing, just to give the framework. I never thought of what I have done as being new institutionalism. Mm. I feel that it is partly an apt description and partly not. And this is maybe a little bit about what you said in terms of socially engaged art. I think some of the projects that we worked with in Munich can be described as such, but many were not at all socially engaged.
Of course.
Many were process-oriented, but not all of them. There were also projects where there were components that were discrete art objects that could be contemplated, if you wish, and occasionally even a whole exhibition that was operating more with the mode of individual observation, thoughtfulness. You could also say contemplation. Mm-hmm. So for me, what is absolutely crucial is to start with art And the art that I find meaningful is often quite varied. It takes different shapes and forms, which includes social projects or participatory projects, but it's far from everything. So what you describe as this harmony, I cannot totally recognize.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there was not a lot of agonism within the institution or between, let's say, the curatorial team and the artists. Of course, there were some tensions and problems, but it wasn't like Artur Zmijewski or Andrea Fraser, this, wanting to have a fight. But instead, where the agonism and sometimes even antagonism came was more with the traditional clientele of the Kunstverein. Some members of the Kunstverein, some people who were part of the art scene who felt that what we did was meaningless, incomprehensible, or just downright bad. So what we did was not particularly popular locally. We got much more curiosity, interest, and even appreciation from elsewhere in Germany, as well as internationally. So what you described with the United Nations Plaza, that it was for producers, with producers, was to some degree also true for these 3 years in Munich. It was almost like a research and development department of the art world that had an intensive period at the Kunstverein.
Yeah, very precisely put, research department of the. But when I said about social impact, I didn't mean that you worked only with socially engaged art, but I meant that this type of institution acquired new horizons of impact, new horizon and new hopes, how it could affect sociality. No matter what kind of, well, of course, the art can be versatile, but it had this belief that art institution has this flexible inscription into sociality. Whether or not it was accomplished, it's another question, but it functioned to a certain extent and for some time.
Yeah, there was definitely an interest in trying out slightly visionary, maybe not utopian, but slightly visionary, but also being aware of the obstacles, the resistance, etc. Actually, I like how you concluded with bureaucracy. My friend and colleague based in Stockholm, who's now the director of the Baltic Arts Center in Visby, Helena Selder, she calls it administrative activism.
Yeah, but this comes from Buchlo's text and then develops further. And yeah, I would agree with your colleague.
Yeah. Well, he talks about administrative aesthetics, but she speaks very much about administrative activism, how you consciously work to change things from the inside. And this is maybe what I have described in some texts and which I try to perform in my work in terms of the curatorial, that it's about not necessarily accepting status quo.
Yes, absolutely.
That's where your horizon comes in,
yes,
that there is another horizon.
When I say bureaucracy, I mean it in a very affirmative way and to a certain extent in a revolutionary sense. Why? Because since I am working in academia, I often have to claim that, new ideas are much more produced by bureaucracy than in academia. So academia is a little bit lagging behind this new bureaucracy. And well, this was a new institutional condition when there were the new generation of curators after Zeman or whoever, like you, like Georg Scholhammer, like Zdenka Badovinac, creating these new mobilities and new alliances. And these alliances still have some potential in it.
Right. I think a failure with the Munich project, if I can call it such, and also Roseum and some of the others that Jonas Ekeberg described as being part of this new institutionalism, is that they were so temporary. None of it stayed on. So it was determined by the length of our contracts. In some cases, people also maybe left it if it was a long-term position that they had. And I see today, much later, that it would have been very useful with longer periods. I think the impact would have been different. What we learned and what I took with me personally is definitely how to develop a methodology. And this is, if we go back to why curate art and curating the craft in it, it's so much about being applied. You cannot invent these things just by thinking. You have to do them. It's an applied form.
Yes, yes, thank you. Maybe.
And I'm also thinking in terms of what you said about contemporary art, this idea of craft and what is forgotten. I think for me, maybe Hacke and Fraser, they did great works, but that is also really from a different period, and maybe not the most interesting thing today. Actually, I find it so interesting today with the many artists in different parts of the world, different corners of the planet, who are interested precisely in craft, in
yes.
how materially develop something and how to pick up old traditions that are being repurposed for contemporary use and for future use.
I know this interest of yours, and I know how important it becomes in contemporary exhibitions, and younger generation, they are much more and more interested in crafts. But for me, it also has this political undercurrent, because the more crafts you have, the more you go to fantasy, the more you go to meta-modern direction that somehow distances this fantasized context, imaginary, psychedelic, craft-oriented context from social work or cultural politics, and makes it more interested in fantasy, in
maybe in some cases, but I think there is so much more to this. I think there are completely politically acute work that is using some of these methodologies.
Great, then you have to
I will introduce you to them.
Introduce us to it. Yeah.
Yes. So we've been talking now for almost an hour and a half.
We need someone to intervene.
Yeah, I wonder if those of you who are joining us have questions or comments at this point. I will see them in the chat. Hopefully you too, Ketty. Svetlana is here, and probably you will help us. Yes. Svetlana says no questions so far. So now I'm welcoming them. So let's see what comes in. Another thing which I think about when I talk about this period, so it seems quite a long time ago, is that we really were not good at communicating to the outside world what we did. The program was so complex with the different rhythms, with the different types of projects, and we didn't develop actually a good strategy for how to convey that.
Mm-hmm.
And that was actually a comment we got regularly, that it's so hard to understand what you're doing.
Yeah, this is what I meant, because on the one hand, there was this belief into the public impact of the project and of the institution. On the other hand, de facto, this communicative element that you claim that should be inscribed in art production is not so easily conveyed to the audience or the public or whoever. And this was discrepancy and controversy too. And this is what brings, for instance, Katrina Brown to this discussion that and where is this public? So we constantly claim that we have the public, but this is us. So and with the shrinking of this public in the pandemic, when the global art traveling is diminishing and diminishing, there is certainly a new question, how to construct these communities and how to construct these public contexts again. For instance, if it has to be constructed virtually or digitally.
Yes. Well, but maybe it's a bit like with certain scientific research, that for a period of time, it is relevant primarily to those who, to some degree, are already involved. And this is necessary for it to, at a later point,
Mm-hmm.
be disseminated in other ways to wider circles. It's a bit like the research and development department.
Yeah, I agree. Yes, of course. If you're making research in chemistry or in physics or in programming, you should not expect that, I don't know, huge crowds will come to watch it or to share it. Yet, art has this entertaining part in it, or because social engagement was critical, it was cognitive, it was teaching people how to be socially active, but to what extent it was part and parcel of mass leisure. And maybe art should not become open publicly, and it should never become leisure. Maybe it should just preserve in itself this some sort of hermetic, community-based critical agency. I don't know. I don't have answers to this.
I tend to be a bit of an eclecticist in this, and somebody who looks at the specificities. So to go into the particulars, to look at individual art projects and how they operate, how they function. And that can, of course, also be different depending on when and where they are being public, or where and when they are going public. So I think it is definitely interesting and relevant with an artwork that can be part of leisure culture. It depends on what kind of work it is.
Sure.
At the same time as it can be very hermetic and strange.
Yes, but I would mention how Russian institutions deal with this, and they actually are quite successful. Well, not that they deal with very conceptual or very rigid types of art. They try to be 50-50, sometimes entertaining, sometimes showbiz, sometimes fashion, sometimes design, sometimes serious conceptual exhibition. But their strategy is to draw people to some kind of recreation center. And this is, on the one hand, good to attract public to art. On the other hand, it's quite dangerous because it simply can dissolve the art institution as the territory of this research work. And what I hear from Russian institutions like Garage or like Victoria, we see that they want to create this recreating umbrella for public, which then finds in it, well, some sort of art. Okay, it's fashionable now to look at this type of images. And then the activity around this institution starts. Well, I'm quite suspicious to these kind of strategies. Let's see how they develop. But as far as I know, your institution at Tensta or Vanabe or Ljubljana Museum of Modern Art worked otherwise.
Yeah, at least partly, I agree. It's a very, very interesting topic, but it's getting late, and I want to check in with Svetlana if we have any more, or if we have any comments or questions. Otherwise, I will ask Kitty if you have some final words before I add mine.
Well, I think it was very important for me to talk about these issues, also because I cannot decide what route art should follow, and I'm really interested to interrogate people like you and like other curators, how to deal with what used to take place, for instance, before Trump, after Trump, and in contemporary pandemic conditions, and how art would develop. And the main issue that interests me is with the expansion of art into digital design, fantasy, metamodern contexts, performative entertainment formats. Will the art territory disappear, like some time ago ancient tragedy disappeared or opera disappeared? It still exists as museum, but it disappeared. Or there can be some kind of recharging or resetting of what institution should be in a precise sense that was the genesis of art, first with modernism, then with the second avant-garde, then with social engagement, relational aesthetics, and all those historical stages. So will art stick to those historical paths, or it will dissolve? This is my question. And your experience was an incredible example to show its ardor and its pathos on the stage of its institutional micro-revolution. Yes.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions. One is, recently in Russia, there has been such a situation that the curator and the institution receive financial support for the project, but the artist does not, or it's a very small reward. And what do we think about this? Do we agree with this? I do not agree with this. I think it's very important that if there is a budget and if anybody is paid in a project, the first one should be the artist. The curator, for instance, should only be paid secondarily in that case. Sometimes the fees might not be so big, but there definitely should be a fee of some kind to the artist. And this is something we worked with in Munich. For sure, there were fees for everybody. Even if it was an existing work in a group exhibition, there was a smaller fee, and then if there was a commission, there would be a bigger fee, and often also production money, etc. And then I see a second question. What institutions would you recommend following in terms of innovative management models? now choose to think of it as curatorial models rather than innovative management models. I think VHV, the curatorial collective from Zagreb, What, How, and For Who, consisting of 4 women, they have worked together since the late 90s, have a really interesting approach. Nowadays, they are split between Zagreb, where they curate the Nova Galleria, and Vienna, where they're running the Kunsthalle Wien, the Vienna Art Center, and how they develop project, how they do research, and how they also quite clearly follow certain strands in their work over more than 2 decades. That would be one example. Casco in Utrecht, a small organization experimenting what an art institution of the commons could be like. I am also curious always about Galerie für zeitgenössische Kunst in Leipzig. They have a collection, so there is one side of their work which is more on the classical side, and then there is another side with contemporary projects where they, for example, every year commission a new artist to work with their cafe and to activate the cafe, to redesign the interior of the cafe, etc. And I have to point at some artistic initiatives, collectives. For instance, Cultivator, it's a collective on the island of Öland in the Baltic Sea, the long Swedish island, who combine art and agriculture in inspiring ways. I also find Gorad Ustinov, micro-territory Gorad Ustinov in Ijevsk, inspiring. So those were some examples from my side. Maybe Katie, you have some?
Oh la la. Well, I very much liked Tensta. I don't know what it does now. I agree with you with VHV, and I like the work of Zdenka in Modern Museum of Ljubljana, what she did with the historicizing art. I think that I would name in Russia most importantly the work of Victor Miziano, which I find inspiring, and I think the attitude to art and approach to art, which I find important, is exercised by Institute Baza, which is headed by Anatolia Smolovsky and Svetlana Baskova. Why? Because they try to bring up these angry artists, I would say. So, but well, I think some other things would occur to me with time.
I want to add a couple of more examples also to widen the scope a bit. Ashkal Alwan in Beirut.
Absolutely. I mean, Christina Toma, Ashkal Alwan, this is great. This is absolutely.
And that's a mix of exhibitions, research projects, education, etc. But they're in a deep crisis after both the pandemic and the big explosion in Beirut.
I would add Iflux, and you would agree with me.
Yes, Iflux is another one. And Parasite in Hong Kong.
Yes.
One more question. How much did the history of the venue, and in particular the Ghost of the Degenerate art exhibition, influence your activity? It actually came into this Telling Histories project about the history of the Kunstverein, where we organized the archive and we did the TV shows, etc. Because one of the 3 exhibitions that we picked was by the artist Gerhard Merz in 1989, and he, in his turn, looked back at the Degenerate art exhibition. So we did not ourselves directly do it, but it flowed into what we did through the 1989 exhibition. The Ghost was there, and more than anything, during my last couple of months as the director there, I gave up my apartment and I lived at the Kunstverein. So sleeping at night at the Kunstverein, thinking about that exhibition was spooky. Well, now I would like to wrap up by thanking you so much, Ketty. You're a great discussion partner, so precise, so thoughtful, and I hope we can continue. Definitely. And this series continues. It's 5 webinars all in all. The next one is at the end of March, the 21st of March to be precise, a Monday evening. And the same Victor Misiano that you mentioned, Ketty, has agreed to be my respondent.
Wonderful.
The topic will be Tensta konsthall, so the period I was there, which is from 2011 until 2018. And tonight's session will be published online in case you have not had enough for tonight. Thank you all very much for joining.
Oh, thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.